which is a very strange name for the parsha of the giving of a Torah because it's not exactly clear why that story is so important of Moses' father-in-law showing up. If you really want to get technical, it's not exactly sure. We're not exactly sure when he showed up. If you want to get technical, we're not sure when he left, and we're not sure when when the story that is told about what happened when he was here. We're not even sure when that happened. So it's possible that the story is not in chronological order, which just highlights the question even more. So what's the point of placing it right here? And even more, we're very interested in the names of the parsha. You have a name, you have to sell this parsha and say this is like the most important parsha, the Ten Commandments, the giving of the Torah, and instead we call it Jethro. So it seems like a missed opportunity. It looks like the the PR team was asleep, but that's only on the surface. When you go a little deeper, of course, you say there has to be a profound message there, or messages in the plural. So hopefully, if we stick around long enough, we'll be able to get some of the perspectives. Okay, so as is our custom, I'm going to try to open up the Chabad.org here. Um, Parsha, Parsha in a nutshell. Uh, Share. Okay, Yitro in a nutshell. The name of the Parsha, Yitro, means Jethro. I don't know how it means Jethro. Same name. Um, and is found in Exodus chapter 18, verse 1. Moses' father-in-law Jethro hears of the great miracles which God performed for the people of Israel and comes from Midian to the Israelite camp, bringing with him Moses' wife and two sons. Jethro advises Moses to appoint a hierarchy of magistrates and judges to assist him in the task of governing and administering justice to the people and administering justice to the people. So in other words, that's what I said. It could be this happened later. According to Rashi, Jethro sees that Moshe is judging the people. When is he judging the people? Many weeks and a few months after the giving of the Torah, because they didn't get the law yet. So how are they? There's no judgments yet. But either way, here we read how Jethro sees that Moses is the only judge. He says that's a terrible idea. You have to create a hierarchy of judges and circuits and appellate courts. And God says it's a good idea, and that's what they do. Okay, the children of Israel camp opposite Mount Sinai, where they are told that God has chosen them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The people respond by proclaiming, all that God has spoken, we shall do. On the sixth day of the third month, Sivan, 7 weeks after the Exodus, the entire nation of Israel assembled at the foot of Mount Sinai for the giving of the Torah. God descends on the mountain amidst thunder, lightning, billows of smoke, and the blast of the shofar, and summons Moses to ascend. So in other words, Moshe, all the people do not climb the mountain, except for Moses and other exceptions. There's also Aaron and the 70 elders, but they climb the mountain. God proclaims the Ten Commandments, commanding the people of Israel to believe in God, not worship idols, or take God's name in vain, keep the Shabbat, honor their parents. That's the first five. Then you have not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear the false witness, or covet another's property. The people cry out to Moses that the revelation is too intense for them to bear, begging him to receive the Torah from God and convey it to them. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in a nutshell. Um, the Torah describes with great drama the preparation and the actual event of giving of the Torah, giving of the Ten Commandments. This is a historical event. Changed the face of changed the history of the Jewish people, changed the history of the world. And again, however, the opening story is the story of Moshe's father-in-law joining the people and father-in-law giving advice. That's what fathers-in-law do when they show up, they give advice. The joke is that Moshe hears the advice and says, thank you very much, and then sends him off. So the joke is that's what you do. When they give you advice, you say, thank you very much, and then you send them home. But that's just a joke because Moshe did implement, um, at least in some way, what his father-in-law told him to do. Okay, so that is the big picture. I think we'll start by opening up the verse. We'll read a few verses and we'll see, opening the parsha, we'll read a few verses and we'll see where we get to. Um, Okay, this is the opening. The opening is in, I don't have the article with me, but it's at chapter 18, verse 1. Now, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the chieftain of Midian, heard all that God has done for Israel, for Moses and for the people, and for Israel, his people, and for Israel, his people, that the Lord has taken Israel out of Egypt. So Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent away, and her two sons, one of whom was named Gershom, because he, Moses, said, I was a stranger in a foreign land, and one who was named Eliezer, because Moses said, the God of my father came to my aid and rescued me from Pharaoh's sword. Now Moses' father-in-law Jethro and his Moses' sons and his wife came to Moses to the desert where he was encamped, to the mountain of God. And then they meet, they eat lunch, okay? And then they have this conversation, theological conversation. And the next morning is we hear about the justice. He came about on the next day, verse 13, that Moses sat down to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from the morning to until the evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw that he was what he was doing to the people, he said to him, what is this thing that you are doing to the people? Why do you sit by yourself? Why all the people stand before you from morning till evening? And Moshe says, well, they want to know the word of God. Moses said to his father-in-law, for the people come to me to see God. If any of them has a case, he comes to me, and I judge between man and his neighbor, and I make known the statutes of God and his teachings. Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people who are with you. For the matter is too heavy for you, you cannot do it alone. And he gives him the advice, now listen to me, I will advise you, and may the Lord be with you. You represent the people before God, and you shall bring the matters to God. And you shall admonish them concerning the statutes and the teachings, and you shall make known to them the way that they shall go and the deed that they shall do. But you shall choose out of the entire nation men of substance, God-fearing, men of truth, who hate monetary gain, and you shall appoint over them, meaning over Israel, leaders over thousands, leaders over hundreds, leaders over fifties, and leaders over tens, and they shall judge the people at all times. And it shall be that any major matter they shall bring to you, and they themselves shall judge every minor matter, thereby making it easier for you, and they shall bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and the Lord commands you, you will be able to survive, and also all this people will come upon their place in peace. Moses obeyed his father-in-law and he did all that he said. And a few verses later, it says, Moses saw his father-in-law off, and he went away to his land. That's the joke, that you take the advice, but then you send him away. But that's just a joke. Now, you want to talk about the chronology of this story. I'm going to open one Rashi, and I'm going to show you how Rashi says it's not so clear when this happened, or actually it is clear. It's clear that it did not happen before the giving of the Torah. Jethro came before the giving of the Torah. However, this story that he saw, Moses is judging all the people, that did not happen before the giving of the Torah. If according to Rashi, maybe there are other opinions. What does Rashi say? Vahim macharat, and it came to pass. It came about on the next day or the next morning. The next morning from when? So the simple interpretation is the next morning from when Jethro came. Jethro came before the giving of the Torah. On the next morning, Jethro sees his father-in-law, sees his son-in-law Moses judging the people, and he says it's a terrible idea. So Rashi says it's impossible because there's no judge, there's no Torah, there's no laws to judge before the giving of a Torah. So it has to be after giving of a Torah. But after the giving of a Torah, Moses is too busy. 40 days he's on the mountain. Then they break the tablets because they make the golden calf. He breaks the tablets. The next day, again, he's up 40 days asking God for forgiveness. Then he comes back down, said, God forgave you. Then he goes back up 40 days where he gets the second tablets. And he comes down on Yom Kippur. He gets the second tablets. So Yom Kippur is 3 months. 124 months, 120 days after the giving of a Torah. So it's more than 120 days after Jethro's father came. So what's Vahim Macharat? What's the next morning? So Rashi says, oh, the next morning is the next available morning, the day after Yom Kippur. It was 120 days after the giving of the Torah. Now you have a whole Rashi here. You see how long this is, just to prove this point, which basically says it has to be this. This is out of order. Now, if it's out of order, why is it placed here? Now, the simple answer is because once you open up the story with Jethro, you want to put in everything that happened, right? You don't want to say Jethro came and then change the subject and then say, oh, later Jethro said this. Once we open up the side scene with Jethro, we'll put in everything that happened. I guess that's the simple interpretation. But there are spiritual interpretations of why Jethro has to come at this point and why the parsha is named after him. Okay, so if you want to read the Rashi, I think I said it by heart, but I'll just read a few lines. It came to pass that it came about on the next day. This was the day after Yom Kippur. This is what we learned in Sifri, actually in the Mechilta. Okay. In other words, the comment, whoever printed this comment could not find it in the Medrash of Sifri, says it's in the Mechilta. Okay. Now, what is it meant by on the next day? On the day after his descent from the mountain, which took place on Yom Kippur. So it's 100, at least 120 days later. You must admit that that it is impossible to say that the next day means anything but that, meaning um, Moses sat, meaning after the Yom Kippur. Moses sat down to judge the people on the day after Yom Kippur. Before the giving of the Torah, it was impossible to say, and I make known for them the statutes, because Moshe didn't get the statutes, etc., etc. So that's the technicality. That tells us that this story, Jethro coming, and specifically the story about asking about. Oh, I didn't share my screen. Oh, go ahead, Vicky. I thought the screen was being shared. Either way, I'll share it now so you see how big this Rashi is. But the point here is the point stays the same. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I think it's also in the art scroll. But I had a question. Who was judging the people before the giving of the Torah? Did Moses? I mean, maybe it was happening before giving of the Torah, or nobody was judging. It was like they were still kind of in a transition.
So Rashi's proof that that it happened after Yom Kippur wasn't so much that nobody was judging, because you need judges. You know, this guy picked on me and he stole my place and I took his place. So they're fighting. Everybody will always have what to fight about. But Rashi says the verse that Moshe says to his father-in-law, he says the reason why I'm the only judge is because people come to me to hear the word of God, and he says, and I make known the statutes, etc. That's
But
the verse that Rashi says. I make known the statutes. If you want to see the verse, the verse in the Torah, it's very clear that he's talking about the statutes of God, right? Um,
so before Moses started judging, there was nobody to judge between people. I mean,
I don't know. I don't know. Again, I don't know. Maybe Moshe was judging before, but the key is this conversation between Moshe and Jethro had to have happened after the Torah was given due to verse 16. Verse 16 says, if any of them has a case, he comes to me and I judge between man and his neighbor. That could have been said before the giving of the Torah. That's not the proof. But the fact that it says, and I make known and I make known the statutes of God and his teachings, Rashi says, maybe there are other ways of reading it, but Rashi says this is conclusive proof that this interaction between Moshe and his father-in-law had to have happened after the giving of the Torah.
so what you're saying is before giving of the Torah, Moses had no clue about what's in it.
Even if he judged based on human logic, which is fine. Right? It could be a judge. Your kids come to you. He said, she said, he took my car, I took his car. So you have to adjudicate at some point. What are you adjudicating based on? Did you open up the Talmud before you adjudicate before between your kids fighting? Maybe you should, but not always do you, right? You do there could be adjudication before, but not Moshe's statement. I make known to them the statutes of God and his teachings. How does Moshe know the statutes of God? He had to be on the mountain for 40 days before he learned in order to learn the statutes of God. So that's Rashi's proof that this event happened. Not Jethro indeed came before the giving of the Torah, but the conversation about appointing the judges happens post the giving of the Torah, and that just makes the question bigger. So why is it written here? So I can give you a technical answer, but then you can give a spiritual answer and a figured, in other words, an answer that relates not to a technicality, but relates to everything that we're trying to accomplish with the giving of the Torah. And that will explain why Jethro, maybe one of the reasons why Jethro is so critical to the story of the giving of the Torah. Okay, so where do we start from? Let's start from here. Let's start from saying that like this. We all know that the Torah has two parts to it. There's what they call the written Torah. That's the word of God, written, conveyed to the prophets, Moses, and then later prophets, to the conclusion of the Bible. And then you have what Moses himself also talks about is the oral Torah, the teachings that were passed on orally. And part of that oral process is not just is passing some teachings on orally, but also it's the human perspective. In other words, the Torah doesn't always tell you what to do in every case. The Torah gives you the guiding principles, and then when new cases come up, it's up to the people to apply, to debate, and to interpret and to apply the Word of God. And a lot of people find this strange because when you think about what is religion, religion is revelation of the Word of God. right? All religion has the same thing in common. God comes to people and reveals his will to them, whether however he did it, through a prophet, through writings, whatever it is. But there has to be a process of revelation. The whole reason why people come to religion is because they want to know the word of God. Now, Judaism is very different. Judaism is, yes, we have that element of revelation, but we have to have, you want to know what to do? Well, Shammai says A, Hillel says B. What should we do? Let's take a vote. Let's follow the majority. If I want to know what the rabbis said, I would go to the rabbis. I want to know what God says. Right? So that's what makes a lot of people uncomfortable with Judaism, people who are seeking the word of God, because Judaism does have the word of God, but the word of God doesn't have the final say. In other words, it's part of the package, it's not the whole package. A very important component of Judaism is the oral Torah, which is God gives part of it, and the rest we are supposed to accept, study, try to understand. And because we're human beings are trying to understand, that's why it gets messy. And messy means there are disagreements and there are confusion. And then you have to find ways how to clarify which opinion to follow. And then together you have what we call the written Torah and the oral Torah. And that is a critical process. And if we don't understand this, then we misunderstand the whole point here. Because the point here is not submission to the word of God. That may be other faiths. The point of Judaism is much more of a relationship. It's a connection. It's almost like a marriage. And when you have a marriage, you have to negotiate both perspectives. One party says what he says and says, okay, I understand. There's the old joke about marriage that the woman and man and woman before they got married, they say, how are we gonna decide how to live? We know we have this different differences of opinion. So the husband says, no problem. The wife says, no problem. You're gonna decide all the big questions. I'm gonna decide, says the wife, I'm gonna decide all the small questions. The man was amazing. What a good deal. Could you imagine? The man gets to decide all the big picture, and this and the woman decides all the small pictures, the small details. And then all of a sudden, they come to the questions, where should we send our school? Where should we send our kid to school? His opinion, her opinion. What should we have for dinner? And everything she's deciding. So he says, wait a second, didn't we have a deal that I make the big pictures? She says, of course you make the big decisions. You decide who should be the president of the United States. You decide who should win the Cold War. You decide if we should explore space. The small decisions about our house, that's my domain. Our family, that's my domain. It's the small things. You get all the big things. So that's the joke. The point here is that a relationship is that both parties get together and they have to negotiate. And sometimes we don't like to negotiate because it's messy. I'd rather not negotiate. But that's the whole point here. And the whole point is that it's the marriage, it's the blend of the human wisdom with the divine wisdom. And that's the process of studying Torah. That's what Torah means. Now, of course, there are absolutes. If you look at the Ten Commandments, Dennis Prager, who's Connie's cousin, says God doesn't, it's not, they're not called the 10 suggestions, they're called the 10 commandments. In other words, there are things that is black and white and clear, because that's the divine perspective. But there are some things where it's not clear, and then you need the human perspective. And the connection that when a Jew studies Torah, it's not so much I'm listening to the voice of God, yes, that too, but I'm also involved in the process of applying and understanding and debating, and that's where the human involvement happens, and then we have the merging of the two, and that's what Torah is. Okay. Now, if you think about this for a second, before even we hear about God descending and giving us the word of God, what does the Torah start with? Essentially, in other words, Torah is starting with the oral Torah, story of Judges. How are you going to apply? There's a different opinions. Moses may have one interpretation, another judge may have another interpretation, but the whole concept of bring people who are not prophets. Moshe is the prophet. Moshe says, everyone comes to me to hear the word of God. What does Jethro say? The word of God is nice. We need, yeah, sometimes we have to go hear the word of God, but it's also about the judicial system, which is human beings applying the word of God. And in a way, by placing the story of Jethro even before the giving of the Torah, it's like because the whole oral Torah could lose it could lose the spotlight is put on the revelation, right? The Ten Commandments, that gets all the attention. There's thunder, there's lightning, there's all kinds of exciting things happening. But what about the nitty-gritty of mundane life of people trying to interpret and understand oral Torah? Oral Torah is not as flashy as revelation from above. So even before we talk about the perspective of God, we say, listen, ladies and gentlemen, you want to understand Torah, you got to listen to Jethro. Now, what does Jethro say? Jethro says you got to listen to the voice of the people. Because we're talking about a marriage, we're not talking about submission to the word of God. And that is, if you look at it from that perspective, then placing Jethro, the story of the judges right here, is not just because once we mention Jethro, we may as well pack in all the stories of Jethro so we can get rid of him, get him off the scene, close the play, get this character off the map. No, what his point is, if you want to really understand what Torah is, don't lose sight that yes, God descends from the mountain and says the word of God, but there's also going to be a system of judges. And by the way, right after the Torah, next week is all about civil law. And civil law is basically everything there is subject to debate and subject to different opinions and human wisdom and human application. So, in other words, the giving of a Torah is sandwiched between two stories of the oral Torah. So it's giving us because otherwise the giving of a Torah will get all the attention. We have to realize it's more of a balance because God is more charismatic than the people. So we have to say, listen, the people's role is important as well. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's a beautiful idea. So we're kind of building up on what was already before that, right? So kind of building up on common sense because people were doing something in that sort before, and
Oh,
even Greg
oh,
had something, there's some ideas, there's some basic, unless Moses gave some kind of training to the to the all those heads of thousands and tens.
yeah. So it's a question of how much training they get from Moshe, and it's interesting that what that it's interesting if you look at this. I always found this a very nice subtlety. It's a subtlety, but it's a nice subtlety. I just want to point this out for a second. And just the introduction in the Torah doesn't believe, the Talmud doesn't believe in what do they call it? They call it small claims court. Don't bother the judicial system if you have a dispute about $50. Don't go to the justice system. Don't go to the judicial system. Go to small claims court. And small claims court is not that important because because the stakes are lower. So the burden of evidence that is required and everything is different in small claims court because it doesn't really matter. Now, Judaism, the Talmud says that's a big mistake. The Talmud says when you come into justice, a case of $1 million and a case of $1 has to be treated equally. It's about justice. It's not about how much money, right? So you have to treat every dollar a din, a judgment of $100 and a judgment of $1 has to be treated the same. But that's a difference because nobody does that. That's a different philosophy about what the purpose of judgment of justice is. We can talk about that in a minute too. In other words, some people say justice is just a convenient way to create um, a civilization where people can live in peace, and it shouldn't be everybody just grabbing power for themselves and using violence. So we have to have a system where it was very utilitarian. In other words, there's nothing inherent. Is the judge right or wrong? It doesn't really matter. The point is that we have a forum to adjudicate our disputes, so we don't have to descend to violence. And what the judge decides is less important. That's the conventional interpretation. So it's basically just utilitarian. If it's utilitarian, then yes, $1 billion case is different than a $1 case. But if the Torah is saying, no, it's justice, justice is this belongs to you, then it has to belong to you, it's justice, then the utilitarian, yeah, there is a utilitarian function, but that's not the whole point of justice. The whole point of the justice system is to create justice. And therefore, $1 and $1 million is the same thing. Now, having said that, if you turn to Jethro's words, what does Jethro say? Jethro says like this: They shall judge the people at all times, and it shall be that any major matter they shall bring to you, and they themselves shall judge every minor matter. So in Jethro's words, what do you differentiate? Which cases make it up to the Supreme Court? Which cases make it up to Moses? The major matters. I don't know what major means. In Hebrew, the Davar Gadol, a big matter. What's a big matter? Big matter is a big pile of coins. If it's $1 million, it goes to Moses. If it's a small matter, they're fighting over the potato kugel, then they can decide it on their own. Now, the good news is that we have this story repeated to us by Moses. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses himself repeats this story. And I can open up the repetition if you want, but I could say it by heart, so I don't know what you want to do. The bottom line is this. The bottom line is when Moshe repeats the story and he tells the people what the deal was, he says, I appointed the judges and I tell them as follows. He says, the difficult matter they will bring to Moses, not the big matter. Big means how much money. Difficult means how difficult the law is. So from Moshe's perspective, there's things that are obvious. That's what the judges could the many judges could rule on. And remember, there's a whole hierarchy. Every 10 people has a judge because a judge is not just the judge; it's also a leader. right? You have to travel through the desert. Who's going to walk who? Who's going to hold what? Who's going to carry the suitcases? Every 10 people, you need somebody, you need some form of leadership. So it's justice, but it's also hierarchy to be able to travel. If you look in the system of the army, you have all different types of levels, and the smallest level is a guy commands 5 people, right? So that's essentially what's happening here. But the point is, what Moshe is saying, there are certain things that are obvious. 10 Commandments, don't steal, it can't be that complicated. Then there's the difficult matters. But here, from Moshe's perspective, it's not a question of how much money is at stake, because that really doesn't matter if you're talking about a system of justice. That matters if you're talking about utilitarian system. But from the perspective of the Torah, it's a judicial system, and what matters therefore is the difficulty of the matter. And if it's difficult, then you come to Moshe. But again, yeah, go ahead, Vicky.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Regardless of what you consider difficult, big or small, the preciousness of advice that Jethro gives, it's he wants everybody to get along, to kind of
Yes,
together and no fights regardless of the issue at hand. So
yes,
this is one of the reasons the parsha is called that way. Uh,
yeah,
yeah, Jethro because Yisro because
yes.
because that's very important for people to get along. But I was just wondering, in the later repetition, does Moses give him a credit?
No,
That's okay.
I don't think he gives him the credit. And the reason he doesn't give him the credit is because if you look at the details, eventually, what actually Moshe ends up doing is a very different than what Jethro said. On the surface, it seems like this is one example of a small change. It looks like a small change, but it's a big change. So at the end of the day, if you say, did Moshe's judicial system, the Jewish people judicial system express, was it closer to what Jethro suggested, or were the changes significant enough that when you repeat the story, you don't have to say it happened from Jethro? But
Or
that's,
maybe he had the idea before himself.
I'm sorry.
Maybe he had this idea
Okay,
before.
but here we're putting it to Jethro. Here we here. In other words, the first 4 books is more
Factual.
factual. The second is the story. In other words, what is the lesson? And with there, Moshe is telling it to the people for a lesson, for a purpose, and the purpose is different. Rashi says there they should have. Yeah, we'll have to get to that when we get to the book of Deuteronomy. But the facts are as they appear in the first 4 books. The fifth book is much more of relating the story for the purpose of making certain points. And therefore, the purpose of telling of the story is going to affect the story you're telling, right? If I say, what is your story? Or where does the story begin? You can say, my story began this morning when I wake up. You can say, my story began when I moved to this country. You can say, my story began when my great grandfather decided to get onto the ship. There's so many different stories, all true. What does it depend on? Depend on what's the purpose? What story are you telling? Depending on what story you're telling, you're going to highlight different details. So that's for Deuteronomy. But the point is, yeah, I wanted to address something else that you addressed, which you said, what Jethro said is the word peace. The end of what he says after his whole spiel, he says, if you do this, first of all, if you don't do this, you're going to wither away, and the people are going to be upset, right? If you look at the screen, if you look at the verses, look verse 18, he says the problem. Verse 17 and 18 says it's not good. The thing that you're doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people who are with you, for the matter is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. And then he says, what does he say? Gives them the advice to appoint people. And then he says, what does he say? And then they'll judge everybody. Wonderful. Verse 23. If you do this thing and the Lord commands you, you will be able to survive. Okay, that's one thing. Moshe's survival is a good thing. You won't have to work too hard. Okay, that's good. What else does he say? And all this people, whoops, I lost the place in the most important point. I guess it builds up the drama that way. But I broke the focus. That's not good. Okay, here we are. What does he say? Verse 23. If you do this thing, and the Lord commands you, meaning if God agrees, ask God, you will be able to survive. Okay, and also all these people will come on their place in peace. He makes an emphasis, we're going to create peace. So this is a very interesting insight. And Vicky says that's really the whole purpose of the judicial system is to create peace. I want to add something. I want to add something like this. What's the problem? What's essentially what Moshe is saying is something that everybody deals with. You have to delegate, right? Is that once you grow to a certain thing, you can't do everything alone. You must delegate. And when you start your company, you do everything alone. And a reason companies can't grow is because a lot of people have very difficult time delegating. Now, why do people have a difficult time delegating? So one answer is because they want control. Now, that's not the only answer. Another answer is because they objectively could do a better job. If you ask your children, could you please help clean up the room? So first of all, it's going to take you much more time to negotiate with them. Secondly, it's going to take so in a fraction of time you could have done it yourself. Secondly, when they do it, they don't do it so great, and they complain. And by the time the hour is done, you put in so much effort, and you got an inferior product. You could have done it yourself in a fraction of a time, and everybody will be happy. So that's the resistance to delegating. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to get political, but there was a president of these United States in my lifetime. I'm not going to say his name, but I'm going to say that some people thought he was a little arrogant. It's not unusual if you're the president of the United States, maybe you have the right. Okay. But I remember reading about an interview, and basically this was very early on in his campaign, and he was like saying that he appointed the people for his campaign, his campaign director, his communication director, and he said, and I was like, this is weird. But then I said, maybe it's true. He said, I can do any of these jobs better than the people I hired. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. That was his estimation of himself. I'm better. I hire a communications director, but I'm better at communications than him. So why do I have to hire him? Because I can't do everything, right? Maybe, let's say he's right. That's a frustration. You have to hire people to work for you, but you'll do a better job. Any of these jobs you can do a better job. You just can't do everything. So you try to hold on to it as much as possible. So that's the problem with delegation. Where is that wrong? So you could say it's wrong on a practical level, but from a spiritual level, it's totally wrong. From educational level, it's totally wrong. Because if the purpose is, let's go back to the metaphor of getting your kids to clean the bedroom. If the purpose is to get a clean bedroom, of course you should do it alone. And of course, if you can't do it alone and you have to delegate to your kids, it's not as good. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is to get buy-in, that they should feel invested, that they should feel that they have to participate, and they do participate in the maintaining of the household. And then even if they do an inferior job, because they're not as perfect as you, not that you're perfect, but in comparison, but the whole point is that they are invested. And if they are invested, then they're going to try to keep it clean. And they're going to try to invest in other ways. And ultimately, there'll be peace. Because what is peace? Peace is when the whole company and everybody in this society buys into the same values. But if the person on top is doing everything and not allowing for the people under them to invest and contribute, then you're not going to get any buy-in. If you're not going to get into any buy-in, you're not going to get peace. And in a way, that's the purpose of the oral Torah, connecting it to our first point. What's the oral Torah? God can tell you in every single case exactly what to do. If your cow gores my cow, and we're not sure what to do, instead of asking Shammai and Hillel, pick up the phone, call God, say what to do. I'm sure God could have found a way to speak to a prophet and convey the will, but that's not the point. God says, Torah lo b'shamayim, Torah is not in heaven. After Sinai, there's no more. After the conclusion of the Bible, there's no more revelation. And a prophet cannot interpret the Torah any better than a sage. Sages, any person with using their logic. Because the point is not to figure out what would God say. That too. It's what do you think God would say? That's the point. The buy-in. And that's where you get peace. Because peace is where it's not superimposed. Because if you're superimposing your will either on your kids or on your neighbor, or God's superimposing his will on us, it doesn't work. It works temporarily. Look what happened after 40 days with the golden calf. God says, don't serve idols. Okay, it didn't really work. Took us some time until we bought into the concept. Took us about 1,000 years. But the point here is that the idea that Jethro was saying, the whole community, a whole nation will come in its place in peace is really the justification of why you have to delegate. Not because you're going to get a superior product, not because you need their help, but because you need their buy-in. And that's a very important point. And that's all in that word, Yavo Makom B'Shalom, which Vicky identified. And I think that's very powerful stuff. Okay, so it's all about relationship. It's all about the merging of the oral Torah and the written Torah, the divine perspective and the human perspective, and it's all about God delegating to us and we creating the buy-in. And by delegation, by us doing our part, that's how you get the buy-in, and that's how ultimately you get to transformation. Because transformation cannot come from above; it has to be. There's a family man. I'm not. We have stories in my own family. Well, my mother's family. They had one child that had a very difficult time in the educational system. Some people in life, they're very successful, but they're not very successful students. And this guy was not a successful student. In fact, he was probably closer to a failure as a student. In life, he became very successful and a very prominent member of the community and very successful and very philanthropic, very successful person. But in school, it was a disaster. Till he graduated school, he was an absolute failure of a student. So my grandparents, they wrote a letter to their Rebbe describing what to do, how do you educate this child, etc. And the Rebbe said a few things, which I have a copy of the letter. I'm not going to say the names. I'm not going to embarrass anybody. But essentially, what the Rebbe said is find a place in the camp or in the summer or whatever, find a place where he can be a leader. He's not a good student, but he's a very good leader. Find a place where he can be a leader, where he can lead, where he could show other kids how to navigate. And if you do that, that's where he'll find success. Right? So what are you doing? I'm trying to tell you how to live. I'm trying to tell you how to learn. I'm trying to tell you, stop telling the person what to do. Give the person an avenue where they can give, where they can contribute. Maybe they're not going to be as good as somebody else, but they're going to contribute. You're going to get buy-in. You're going to get peace. So that is a little bit about the introduction of Jethro. Yeah, so far so good. Comments, questions? Everybody's happy? Amazing. Okay. Now I want to move on to another topic, which relates to the idea also Jethro's coming, but relates to what Vicky said, and it's going to relate to the Ten Commandments. It's going to relate to many different areas. And I'm just trying to debate where to start from. Okay, I'll start from the point itself, and then we'll connect it back to Jethro. One strange thing about, let me put it to you this way. If God were to descend on what mountain would God come to if the God's coming to the North America? If God had to descend somewhere in North America, I don't know, the Grand Canyon, I don't know. If we would all have a mass revelation right here tomorrow morning, right? Because that's essentially what happened. So let's think about this for a second. What would you expect God to say? Imagine you're a prophet. You essentially what happened. So this is a very interesting point. I'm just going to touch upon that Judaism is very different than every other religion. In fact, it's so different that basically every element of Judaism has been copied by other religions except for this story. And I say this, we can't dramatize this enough. There are a lot of religions. It's not so hard to start a religion. There's like 3,000 religions, 2,500 religions in the world. It's not that difficult to start a religion. It's not that difficult. You have to be charismatic. That's all you have to have, the only component. You basically have to say, you have to convince people that God spoke to you, or you and a small group of people. So you can create a conspiracy. You're one person, you're five people, you're six people, you're 12 people. It's very easy to create a conspiracy. It's not so hard to do. Judaism's conspiracy, quote unquote, Judaism's story is one that it's a very difficult story to get off the ground. And to prove my point that it's difficult to get it off the ground, I'll just say no one ever tried it. Nobody ever tried the story. The story is like this. The story is not that there was revelation, but there was mass revelation to tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people, and they've told that to their children. In the annals of religion, there is no story of mass revelation. There's no such thing. It's very hard to create a conspiracy like that. Because then I have to convince you, not that God spoke to you, to me, that's relatively easy, but I have to convince you that God spoke to us. That's a little harder. So the point here is whether or not you think you can create a conspiracy like this or not is not the discussion. Discussion is no one ever tried to remake the story. No one, there's no such story. There is a story that there was mass revelation to a million people, but all those million people died, and only one person was left to tell the story. Okay, so you're back to square one. You're back to you're relying on one person. So there's mass revelation. Everyone gets prophecy. So I ask you, if we were all going to get prophecy, what would you expect God to tell us? I think we would expect God to tell us something extraordinary, something that we could not figure out on our own, something that we cannot read in the library, right? Because if the whole purpose is, if God finds it his business to come down and tell us how to live, so let him come tell us how to live, right? What's this business? What is this point that you have to tell me something that I already know? So I would think that that's what would happen. And in that light, it's strange that the Ten Commandments, certainly the second half of the Ten Commandments, are quite obvious. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't testify falsely, and even don't covet, which is depends what you think about coveting, which is emotional, but at least the way the halacha reads it, is don't take action because of your coveting. It's not that when you walk by someone else's his house and you say, "Oh, I wish I had the house." According to, let's say, for example, Maimonides, that's not a violation of do not covet. If I want your house so badly that I that moves me to to action and say, "Sell me your house," and you don't want to, so then I keep harassing you to sell my house. That's the violation. So the point is, let other people have what they have, leave it alone. The point here is these are not earth-shattering moments. These are things that are quite obvious. So the question is, why do you need mass revelation? And the way the Torah describes it, there's sounds and there's thunder and there's lightning and there's revelation and the people are frightened by the word of God. And what does God say? Don't kill. You don't need God to say that. We believe there were seven Noahide laws that Moses was told. We believe that the six of them were told to Abraham, to Adam, don't kill is one of them. And I'll say even more. There's this whole story with Cain and Hevel, where Cain kills Hevel, and God comes to Cain and says, "Where's your brother Hevel?" So Cain says, "I have no idea. I'm my brother's keeper." And God says, "The voice of your brother is calling out from the earth." What does that even mean? What's the conversation? So there's many ways of reading that story. But one way of reading that story is Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper? Nobody told me I'm responsible for my brother. Nobody told me I can't kill my brother. We didn't get 10 commandments yet. Nobody said you can't kill." And what does God say? The voice of your brother's blood calls out from the earth. Now, for modern philosophy, this makes sense. Basically, what he's saying is there's something called natural law. God doesn't have to tell you from heaven not to kill. That concept comes from the earth and emerges from the earth. It's natural law. You can figure it out on your own. And that's what God tells Cain on the chapter 4 of Genesis. And we're thousands of years later at the Torah. And what does God have to say? Simple natural law, simple things. So that's a question that I know the giving of the Torah is wonderful and it's beautiful and it's nice. And the first five are interesting. Shabbat, honoring parents, which is a very tricky business. Sounds like a nice thing. It's honoring parents is very, very difficult. You read the Talmud. Talmud says, I hate to say this. I confess, I wanted to give a class. I want to give a class about honoring parents. So I speak to my chief consultant, which is my wife, and she says, don't do it. It's just too difficult of a class. But the point is, I'm just going to give you an example. The Talmud says the only way to truly honor your parents, to not violate that commandment, is if you're an orphan. And if you're an orphan from both your parents, even better. Right? It's impossible. How are you going to honor your parents to the extent that the Torah wants you to? So that's the first five commandments. Shabbat, a beautiful idea. But the second five, come on, these are obvious things. So that's the question of that's something you have to address. And this we could talk about for a while. We only have about 10 minutes left because I have to get off at 1 minute before 1 o'clock. So we'll take a question or two, 2 minutes before 1 o'clock. But this is what we have to deal with. It's not a simple matter. And there's, again, many ways to think about this and many angles to come at this. So I'll catch my breath. And if anyone wants to share something on this question, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll come and offer a few perspectives. Fine. Okay. So the first perspective would be as follows. The first perspective would be, and this is a philosophical question. Could you And what I'm saying is controversial, not because I don't think it's controversial on this call, but I think it's controversial in the West, at least right now. The question is, could you have ethics based on human logic? Or do you need ethics based on a higher source? Call it religion, call it God. And there's an argument to be made, especially after the 20th century. There's an argument to be made, and I'm willing to stand behind this argument. I know many people will disagree with me. I don't think you will, but I think some people will. And the argument will be made is that logic, human logic, is a very weak foundation to build an ethical system. Because yes, people have all kinds of ideas of what the right way to live is, but they have to have a reason not to turn against those ideas when their interests when turning on those ideas align with their interests. So in the 20th century, you had some of the greatest philosophers in the West, in Germany, and because of the pressures and because of whatever it is, at some point they turn it and they throw out all human ethics and they create a genocide and the Holocaust. So The point here is, yes, you could understand do not kill. That's obvious. You don't need God to tell you that. But you need God to say the moral authority that this is allowed, not because the human mind thinks it's not allowed. Because if it's relied on the human mind, then it works to a degree. But at a certain point is what's going to force me to not change what the human mind says. If the human mind says, "I think it's logical to kill people because they're not contribute because they're not Aryan or they're subhuman or whatever the case is," then that same logic would carve out all the exceptions and say you can't kill except. So where's the absolute? The absolute must come from the fact that it is divine, that the morality is based on divine truth. So in other words, what we're trying to say is the second five commandments. The point is not that the human being couldn't think of those on their own. The point is the Torah makes the divine revelation makes it absolute morality, and absolute morality can only be imposed by the Creator, by something outside the system. Now, if you think of that perspective, it's very interesting that the first five commandments are actually much longer. Every commandment is introduced. Not everyone, but at least the first two are a great length. Shabbat is explained. Even the honoring your father, there's a reason, honor your father and mother, so that you will live long on the land. So it's almost like God is negotiating and trying to convince us to keep the first five. The second five, there's no convincing. It's almost like you ask your parent, why do I have to do that? Because I said so. Do not kill, because killing is not, in Genesis, is a reason. Don't kill because man is created in the image of God. Not in the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments, the second five, which is basically the foundation of of treating other people with morality. There's no negotiation, there's no explaining. That's not the point. We understand this. That's not the point. That's not the contribution of the Ten Commandments to convince you that stealing is a bad idea. The purpose of the Ten Commandments is to make it absolute. And and that's why we're not going to explain. The first five, you have to explain because you're introducing new ideas. Shabbat is a new idea. One God is a new idea. So you have to negotiate, have to explain. But morality, don't kill, don't steal, it's not about explaining. People already understand it. It's about coming and giving it the moral authority. Now, if you look at it this way, this can take us in all different directions. Just one direction, just to be consistent with what we've been saying till now, is that this is really the marriage of the human and the divine. God is not superimposing his will. We understand that we shouldn't steal. God doesn't have to force us. But on the other hand, we are saying the authority of that is not just human, but it's also divine. So at the end of the day, why am I not killing? It's both. God is telling me not to do what I already understand is the right thing to do. I just need the divine to make it absolute. So in a way, it's again coming together with the human perspective and the divine perspective. And to zoom out for a second, in a way, that's what the Torah is telling. I ask you a question. Why wasn't the Torah given to Adam? Why do you have to wait the Torah was given Torah was given in the year from creation from Adam 3,000 and I don't know, excuse me, 3,300. 3,300? The year 3,000, so it's really it's 2,500 out, a little less than 2,500 years after Adam, Torah was given. The year 3,300 or whatever. So the question is, why was the Torah not given? So one answer may be, I don't know. I never spoke to God about this in our conversations. No, I never spoke to God about this. I don't know. But one theory is like this. God is not going to give the Torah until humanity advances to the point where they could understand those values. So if God will come and say, don't steal, and we all think we should be stealing, then God is superimposing his will. It's not going to work. You have to have emerging. You have to have the point where humanity develops to a point where they are developed enough to be able to internalize those concepts. And then
Mm.
you have divine says this is absolute. And now we have a marriage of those 2 points. If that's the case, says the Kabbalah, says the Zohar, the Torah cannot be given until Jethro shows up. What does Jethro represent? Jethro represents the Torah says he's a Kohen Midian. He's the greatest priest in Midian. And the Medrash says, wow, he's such a great priest. He knows every idol. In other words, he represents the wisdom of the time. And when someone representing the wisdom of the time, even the pagan wisdom of the time, recognizes the truth of God and comes to the desert, in other words, the world itself is ready to hear. And then God is ready to speak. Because again, it's not superimposing. It's those two components, the human and the divine, coming together in the Jewish people, but also in the rest of the world. So God is not going to speak to the Jewish people before Jethro says, this is attractive. I want to come. I want to listen. And by the way, according to most opinions, he does not convert. He goes home, goes back, right? So he still remains the person. His descendants converts, at least some of them. But there's no record, right? He's going back home. After Sinai, he goes back home. The point is, he doesn't have to be Jewish. But the point is, the wisdom of the time has developed to the point where we can recognize the will of God. And now, when God comes and God says, now we understand this is absolute. It's not just a product of human knowledge. But the point is, the whole idea of the Torah is not to be superimposed upon us or not fully superimposed. There has to be a human component where humanity as a whole. And by the way, this is what Torah has a mission for. Torah has a universal mission. If the Torah is just about the Jewish people, Jethro doesn't have to come. And don't name the parsha Jethro, right? We're naming the parsha Jethro because the Ten Commandments, the Torah has a universal message, and it can only be said when the humanity is ready to listen. And then we have that merging. Okay, Vicky, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm just hoping that we're ready to listen as a people today, which doesn't look so. And also, the Torah was given only to Jewish people, and also that the commandments can be twisted, as we see from by other religions, even within the Jewish religion. So what do we do with that?
I would say it's a process. I would say just because we're ready to listen and we have the capacity to listen, it doesn't mean we're perfect. In other words, we all understand for the most part, not everybody, but for the most part, when we do something wrong, it's not that we think it's right, it's we know it's wrong. Then it's a question of doing what you know is right. So it's a process, of course, and it's one step back and two steps forward. But the idea that most of the, even in today's modern world, every dictator knows that you have to say you're pro-human rights because even the dictators say that, right? Because it's a logical thing. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I'm a little uncomfortable about this argument because it means that the um, logic, it's what the atheists say. It's the logic of the do not steal. Not the first five, but the
Right,
second five are how you build a civil society and all, and it's just logically on that. The other side of it, we're not animals. That my dog will kill and he'll take another dog's bone or something like that, and all. And it the rule of civilization through the atheist's mind is this is how humans get together,
right,
and this is how they survive. Now the flip side is, so what? I mean, that's where the moral side comes in. Who cares
right.
that it produces a civil society, and all. And so that's where I think the art that you
I'll
fight
push
the
back.
atheist.
I don't have that much time, but we'll continue the conversation. Maybe hopefully later this week or Friday or Shabbat. But the point is this: the point is, I'm agreeing with you that logic alone would not create a civilization or not give the guardrails, and that's why
Right.
God has to come and say, "Don't steal," not because it's a bad idea, but because God told you not to steal. So I agree, but I do agree that it happens to be that some of these basic, in other words, do I agree in natural law? Do I agree that logic would say, "Do not kill"? Of course, I agree. Of course, there's such a thing as natural law. The question is natural law enough, or do you need religious law as well? Or do you need moral teachings as well? That's
Yeah,
my
we can continue because I think they oppose natural law. The
okay.
atheists, it's a logic, not it doesn't emanate. Natural law implies a moral authority or a god, and they are totally against that. Anyway,
Okay, I think we have to continue, but thank you all for joining. It's been wonderful, and we'll see each other in good health. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you all.